You stare at the screen for a moment longer than you expected. Someone just asked a question you have probably heard before, but this time it feels different. If the resurrection is the foundation of Christianity, how do any of us know what really happened? You want to answer immediately. Maybe you already have an answer, maybe you have heard one your entire life. But then something uncomfortable happens. You realize that certainty and evidence are not always the same thing. Most people never notice the difference because they have never needed to, until someone asks a question that refuses to leave. Suddenly you are no longer defending a historical event. You are defending the way you have always understood reality. That is a much more personal battle. We like to believe our deepest convictions come from careful reasoning. Yet psychologists have spent decades showing that identity often comes before logic. We naturally protect the beliefs that give our lives meaning. That does not make those beliefs false. It also does not automatically make them true. It simply makes us human. Imagine discovering tomorrow that the story which shaped your family, your values, your hopes, and even your understanding of death rests on evidence that historians still debate. Would you calmly examine every argument, or would you instinctively protect the worldview that has carried you through life's hardest moments? Most people believe they would choose reason. Human history suggests otherwise. Before we go any further, I want you to be honest with yourself. If you have ever wrestled with this question, or if you think the answer is obvious in either direction, write your perspective below. The interesting part is not whether people agree. The interesting part is why intelligent people can examine the same historical claims and arrive at completely different conclusions. That is where this conversation becomes much bigger than one event in ancient history. It becomes a conversation about memory, identity, hope, fear, and the stories human beings build their lives around. What if the most important question is not whether someone can prove or disprove the resurrection beyond all doubt, but why this question continues to provoke such powerful emotional reactions 2,000 years later? That possibility is far more unsettling than it first appears because it forces us to examine not only history, but ourselves. As the conversation grows deeper, something unexpected begins to happen. The discussion slowly stops being about an empty tomb and starts becoming about the people standing around it. Throughout history, thoughtful scholars, historians, theologians, philosophers, skeptics, and ordinary people have examined the same limited collection of ancient sources and reached remarkably different conclusions. Some see compelling reasons to accept the resurrection as a historical event. Others view the accounts as expressions of sincere belief shaped by memory, tradition, symbolism, or the ways communities preserve transformative experiences. Neither observation can erase the existence of the other. That uncomfortable reality exposes something about the human mind. We often assume that if the evidence were truly decisive, everyone would naturally agree. Yet almost every major question about history, politics, morality, and even science demonstrates that people rarely interpret information in a perfectly neutral way. Expectations, prior beliefs, emotional investments, and social identity quietly influence how evidence is weighed long before we realize they are doing so. Think about the last time you changed your mind on something that mattered deeply. Chances are it was not because someone overwhelmed you with facts in a single conversation. It was because something happened in your life that slowly made a different explanation possible. Perhaps disappointment created room for doubt. Perhaps hope made an old idea feel alive again. Perhaps loss forced you to ask questions that certainty could no longer silence. Human beings do not simply collect information. We construct meaning. That realization makes historical questions unusually difficult because the stakes extend far beyond the past. If the resurrection is true, many people see it as a source of hope that suffering is not the final chapter. If it is understood differently, others believe it reveals something equally profound about humanity's search for meaning in the face of death. Notice what happens psychologically. Both perspectives are responding to the same universal problem. Every person eventually confronts mortality. Every person wonders whether love, sacrifice, justice, and consciousness ultimately disappear or continue in some way beyond death. Long before anyone studies ancient manuscripts, They are already carrying those questions inside themselves. This is why debates about religion rarely remain purely intellectual. They touch the deepest emotional structures people possess. Imagine two friends attending the same funeral. One leaves convinced that death has been defeated because of the resurrection. The other leaves believing that the power of the story lies in how it inspires courage despite uncertainty. Outwardly, they witnessed the same ceremony. Inwardly, they experienced entirely different realities. Which one is responding more rationally? The question itself may be too simple, because rationality is never completely separated from human experience. We interpret the world through memories, relationships, fears, expectations, and personal histories that no one else can fully see. This is where many conversations collapse. Instead of asking why another person reached a different conclusion, we immediately assume ignorance, dishonesty, or blind loyalty. Yet genuine understanding usually begins with a more difficult question. What experiences made this explanation feel compelling to them? That question does not require abandoning conviction. It requires curiosity. Curiosity is uncomfortable because it admits that another person's perspective may contain insights we have overlooked, even if we ultimately disagree with their conclusions. There is another psychological pattern worth noticing. Many people believe certainty feels strong, but certainty can also become fragile. When identity depends entirely upon never questioning a belief, even a simple question can feel like a personal attack. The opposite extreme exists as well. Some people become so committed to skepticism that they reject every possibility before examining it carefully. Both responses may arise from the same underlying desire for psychological safety. One protects certainty by refusing doubt. The other protects doubt by refusing certainty. In both cases, the emotional mechanism is surprisingly similar. If this tension feels familiar, leave your perspective below. Have you ever found yourself defending an idea before you fully understood why you believed it, or questioning one you once considered unshakable? Those moments often reveal more about our own minds than about the topic itself. The longer you examine this question, the more you realize that history alone may never satisfy every person. Ancient events cannot be replayed. Absolute certainty remains beyond our reach. Instead, each generation must decide how to interpret incomplete evidence while recognizing the limits of human knowledge. That realization frustrates many people because we naturally crave definitive answers. We want history to function like a recording that can simply be replayed. Instead, we inherit fragments, testimonies, traditions, archaeological discoveries, philosophical arguments, and deeply personal experiences. We assemble them into narratives that help us understand ourselves. Whether one ultimately embraces the resurrection as literal history, symbolic truth, or something else entirely, the question continues to endure because it reaches beyond evidence into the deepest parts of what it means to be human. Perhaps that is why this conversation has survived for centuries. It is not merely asking what happened long ago. It is quietly asking what kind of world we believe we inhabit, how we decide whom to trust, how we respond to uncertainty, and whether hope requires certainty in order to remain meaningful. Those questions become even more unsettling once you realize where they eventually lead. Eventually, you arrive at a realization that neither side of the debate can easily escape. The greatest challenge may not be determining exactly what happened in first-century Judea. The greater challenge is understanding why every generation returns to the same question as though it were asking it for the first time. We live in an age that has placed extraordinary confidence in technology, data, and instant access to information. Yet some of the most important questions remain stubbornly resistant to complete resolution. We can measure the age of distant stars, map the human genome, and communicate across continents in seconds, but questions about ultimate meaning, purpose, consciousness, morality, and transcendence continue to provoke disagreement among thoughtful people. That should make us pause. It suggests that not every significant human question can be answered in the same way we solve a mathematical equation. This is where many people become uncomfortable, because uncertainty often feels like weakness. We are taught that confidence is strength and hesitation is failure. Yet history repeatedly shows that intellectual humility has been one of the greatest strengths behind genuine discovery. Every major breakthrough began with someone willing to admit that the current explanation might be incomplete. That willingness is not the same as rejecting everything that came before. It is the courage to keep asking honest questions without assuming that curiosity itself is a threat. Consider how often people search not only for answers, but for certainty. Those two desires are related, but they are not identical. An answer can satisfy the mind, while certainty promises emotional security. The difficulty is that life rarely grants absolute certainty about the matters we care about most. Love cannot be mathematically proven before we commit to another person. Trust is never established with perfect information. Parents raise children without guarantees. Entrepreneurs build companies without certainty of success. Friends place confidence in one another, despite the possibility of betrayal. Human existence is filled with decisions that require acting before every question has been resolved. Religious belief, disbelief, and everything in between often exist within that same human reality. Some people conclude that the historical case for the resurrection is sufficiently persuasive to justify faith. Others conclude that the evidence does not meet the standard they require for such an extraordinary claim. Both groups are attempting to make sense of incomplete historical information, even if they disagree profoundly about where it leads. Recognizing that complexity does not eliminate disagreement, but it can transform the way we disagree. Instead of treating those with different conclusions as enemies to defeat, we can begin to understand them as fellow human beings, wrestling with many of the same fears and hopes that we carry ourselves. There is another layer that often goes unnoticed. Many of us believe we are searching for truth, when, beneath the surface, we are actually searching for reassurance. We want reassurance that suffering has meaning. We want reassurance that justice ultimately matters. We want reassurance that death does not erase everything we love. Others seek reassurance that they are living honestly, refusing to accept claims without sufficient reason. Those motivations are deeply human. They do not automatically determine whether any particular conclusion is correct. But they remind us that our emotional lives are never completely separate from our intellectual ones. The conversation therefore becomes less about winning and more about understanding why certain ideas resonate so powerfully across cultures and centuries. Ask yourself a difficult question. If tomorrow someone presented an argument that genuinely challenged one of your deepest convictions, what would happen first? Would your initial response be careful reflection, or would it be self-protection? Most of us like to imagine we are fearless seekers of truth. Psychology suggests we are often defenders of identity before we become investigators of evidence. Simply recognizing that tendency is already a significant step toward greater honesty. It invites us to hold our convictions with both confidence and humility, acknowledging that sincere, intelligent people can disagree while still pursuing the same goal of understanding reality as faithfully as they can. Whether you approach this topic from faith, skepticism, or somewhere in between, perhaps the most valuable outcome is not leaving with every answer resolved, but leaving with a greater appreciation for the depth of the questions themselves. Questions that have endured for 2,000 years rarely survive because they are trivial. They survive because they touch something permanent within the human condition. They force us to confront mortality, hope, memory, evidence, meaning, and the limits of our own perspective. They remind us that being human often means living in the space between certainty and uncertainty, conviction and curiosity. If this discussion has challenged one of your assumptions, whether it strengthened your existing view or encouraged you to reconsider it, share your perspective below. Not because agreement is the goal, but because thoughtful conversations grow stronger when people explain not only what they believe, but why. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson is that our willingness to ask difficult questions with intellectual honesty and genuine respect for those who answer differently says as much about our character as any conclusion we ultimately reach.